Theology at Seton Hall University. With a background in parish catechesis and Catholic schools, Dr. Manning specializes in the area of practical theology with a particular interest in religious education and catechesis. His recently published book, Converting the Imagination, Teaching to Recover Jesus' Vision for Fullness of Life, presents a new approach to religious education focused on helping people find meaning in the Christian tradition for their lives in the face of the challenges presented by postmodern pluralistic culture. And this book is available here today. This program is sponsored by the Bernard Lonergan Institute at Seton Hall, one of many centers worldwide that studied the work of Bernard Lonergan, 1904 to 84, who was a 20th century Catholic philosopher and theologian whom Newsweek cited as among the finest philosophical thinkers of the 20th century. Launched in November 2006, the Bernard Lonergan Institute is dedicated to the study of his ideas and their application in contemporary culture. The Institute is directed by Dr. Gregory Floyd and contains all of Lonergan's published works, copies of his most significant unpublished writings, and other items. In addition to ongoing research and scholarship, the Institute focuses on faculty development and sponsors advanced study, faculty and student reading groups, ongoing programs, and the publication of its acclaimed journal, The Lonergan Review. I'm pleased to introduce Core Fellow and Director of the Center for Catholic Studies, Professor Gregory Floyd, who will introduce our topic and our speaker more fully tonight. Thanks again for joining us both here and virtually, and please stay updated on coming events by visiting our website. Our next event will be the Fall Toth Lonergan Endowed Chair Lecture with Professor J. Michael Stebbins on December 8th. Thank you, and Greg.
Good evening, everyone. Especially I'm mindful of the 10 or 15 people we have online. Welcome virtually and in person to Seton Hall for our 2021 Fall Lonergan Lecture. Once a semester, the Institute, in conjunction with the Center for Catholic Studies, tries to bring a scholar of Lonergan's thought, but also someone who's applying it and developing it in interesting ways to wider concerns in our contemporary culture to campus to talk a bit about the intersection of these two things. And we have no better person than our own local talent, our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Patrick Manning, here in the seminary, as Danut said, professor of pastoral theology. I just want to make one note. Here's the book. It's wonderful. I'm farther along than this would indicate, I promise, though I have not finished it. But Pat's book, Converting the Imagination, engages Lonergan's thought at crucial moments, an interest that I'd like to think was stoked, at least in part, by his former roommate and graduate school friend, perhaps, yours truly. But it's a beautiful meditation and exhortation and pedagogical workbook, really, for engaging one another, and in a particular way, our students, in conversations around the Christian tradition that can be meaningful to them. And the insight driving the book and driving part of Pat's discussion today, I'm sure, is that for something to be true in its deepest sense, it has to be meaningful for people, that they can't appropriate it if it's merely something they memorize or a system of concepts they absorb in a more superficial way. So how do we think about the role of the imagination? Something that Lonergan speaks about, but it doesn't fall directly in the three-part schema he lays out. So I think it's a very useful, a very important, a very compelling sort of contribution and development of Lonergan's cognitional theory, and will help us see its usefulness for not just the theory that many of us love, but also the practical implications and uses of it in daily life. So Pat, we're happy to have you. Without further ado.
So thanks so much to Greg for the invitation. It's a joy to be here. Thanks to Danut for organizing. Thanks to everyone for being here, both in person and the folks at home. I want to, before I even start, take a moment and honor the great ones who have gone before me. I think Mark Miller is actually online there. So I was really flattered and honored when Greg asked me. So I hope I do him proud here. So as Greg said, he asked me to talk about my book in relation to Lonergan. And especially in the latter parts, it's a very practical book. It's a book about teaching, and so the aim was to do something that was going to be of service to teachers, to catechists, and so I've had some opportunities to do workshops, to be working with those kind of people, but it's also all that is built upon a foundation of kind of a view of the longer cycles of progress and decline. That's really important and really informs my work. And so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about the heavier, deeper, more intellectual side of things as well here today. So, in the early chapters of the book, there is a discussion of, really issues of progress and decline. And so when we think about, what is it that progress leads to, what are we striving for or hoping for? Well, what are the things that we all want for our lives? We want meaning, we want purpose, we want happiness. And so Lonergan talks about, Christianity and religion as promoting progress, as leading to these sort of things. To speak more scripturally, Jesus said, "I've come that they might have life and have it in abundance." So, this is what's being held out to us is, this fullness of life, a life of meaning and purpose. And yet, all of us here know that's not always our experience, right? Besides just having tough days, there are also ways in which life really fails to live up to that promise. So Lonergan talks in Method about the fact that that meaning and the traditions that bear that meaning can degenerate, that things can break down. And so I've speak very practically, I certainly see this in the lives of my students this semester. This semester, I'm teaching Journey of Transformation. I didn't do it last year, and so I sort of spared a lot of the travail that I know Greg and others were dealing with in the midst of the pandemic, but I see this all over the faces of my students. That to say that they're falling short of fullness of life is an understatement. And I don't say that in a judgmental way. It's just that this is really, we're in a tough spot right now. So, coming with my students coming into the class every day, I see a lot of anxiety. They have a hard time focusing. They're disoriented. They're lonely. We had a conversation early in the semester where they talked about the fact that they feel that so much of life, especially, the romantic side of things, everyone's just playing a game. And I know this is not just the experience of my students, not just because I've talked to other people who are teaching here, but also because of what we're finding from national data. The Springtide Institute in a recent study found that 40% of young people say that they have no one to talk to. 1 in 4 say that they rarely or never have a sense of meaning or purpose in life. So all of this contributes to the really poor mental health that we're seeing in this country, especially among young people. And this also affects the life of the church. It also affects our religions. If so many people are leaving our religious institutions these days, and that's the latest figure I saw was just about 1 in 4 Americans describes themselves as unaffiliated. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that people are not finding meaning, support, and belonging in the church or in their faith communities. And Pope Francis recognizes this. Someone just shared with me, he posted a video for his monthly intention, devoting that to mental health for this month of November. He said not long ago that the serious threat in our more developed nations is the loss of meaning in life. So with all this as background, I basically want to do two things in this talk tonight. And that's talk about why this deterioration of meaning is happening. And secondly, what can educators possibly do to address it? So to begin with, why is this deterioration of meaning occurring? You can just advance it whenever you get to it. So, when we talk about these kind of issues of mental health, obviously there are the immediate proximate causes. There's been a lot of studies on the effect of smartphones on social media. Facebook was just in the news recently for not heeding the advice or the findings of their own studies about the negative impact of social media on the mental health of users, especially young people. So there's that. Then there's the most painfully obvious is that we're living in a time of global crisis, of an environmental crisis that our younger generations are much more sensitive to than some of our older generations. And then obviously everything that's been going on with the COVID pandemic. So these are all, obvious and immediate causes, and I don't want, and anything that I'm going to say from here on out, I don't want to downplay the significance of those issues in contributing to the poor mental health. But I also think that there are causes that are maybe more fundamental, but are more subtle. And so I think in particular about this double whammy, or maybe I should speak Lonerganian and say the two blades of an issue here. There is the increasing complexity of the world that we live in, coupled with a loss of resources for making sense of our experiences in the world that we find ourselves in. So let me talk about each one of these in turn. So first, in terms of the increasing complexity of the world that we live in, I'm going to ask you, invite you to kind of think about this in terms of, if you're a teacher, to think about the experience of your students. The Harvard researcher, psychologist, Robert Keegan, who's been very influential, he describes our situation in the contemporary world as being in over our heads. You'd say that the mental demands of contemporary life are far more than the average person is equipped to handle. And as a result of that, we experience life as fragmented, as incoherent. We feel torn in many different directions. So how do our young people, how do the average students experience this today? So, to be clear, on the one hand, there's, our young people today are dealing with many of the same perennial challenges that we've been dealing with for generations. So like anyone in the past, they have the normal cognitive load that's associated with things like with school, just staying on top of their assignments, studying for tests, trying to make grades. They are, especially here at a place like Seton Hall, they're trying to balance school with work. They are planning for a career, trying to chart a course through a major that's going to help them land a job and then trying to find a job eventually. They're navigating the relationships and their families, with their friends, with their romantic interests. So, all this puts a degree of stress on us, but all this is fairly standard. This is, these are things that we've dealt with in the past. But what's more novel in recent times? So our young people, and really all of us, are experiencing an information overload. So just to throw some numbers at you, in 2020, we human beings generate 2.5 quintillion data bytes every single day. The average adult, so think about our students, is probably even a little bit higher, spend 11 hours a day on screens, on devices, often on multiple devices at the same time. Up to 3 hours, or maybe an average of 3 hours of that was spent on social media. And so as we're just getting bombarded by all this information, this data, these different messages, not only is a lot, but it's not coherent, right? It's not as if we're getting a consistent message about the way life is or the way that we should be for ourselves. We're getting it's a cacophony of many different messages. So we're being overloaded with information, with stimuli. But we live in a world that is increasingly marked by a rapid change. So, you think about some generations past where maybe the ideal was to land a good job with General Motors, and many people would happily spend the whole of their lifetime working for that company, and that company would be something of a family for them. People today, our students, they can expect to work an average of 12 different jobs during their lifetime. They can expect to move, to relocate as many times. And so, I've often my own mother, who maybe is tuning in, I'm not sure, has commented that, she kind of admires the way that we kids have traveled and moved about, but there's sort of the dark side of that too, is that, we lack the stability and the sense of really having a home in one place. And then thirdly, there is, and this is, I think, really significant, is the overwhelming, sometimes crushing burden of constructing an identity for ourselves today. In ages past, there would have been more of a standard script for thinking about ourselves and making our way through life. Particularly our religious traditions would have given us a more standard understanding of who we are as human beings, a fairly standard vision of our humanity, what we're here for, what we should be striving for. Whereas today, it's much more a work of bricolage, of trying to piece together some kind of identity by just grabbing at the different fragments that, again, think of the lives of our students. Think about the way that they do this very often in virtual spaces. So curating an identity, a persona for themselves, constructed in terms of, the things they wear, the music they listen to, who they're spending time with, the brands that they affiliate with. There's less of a default, there's less of a standard script. And so there's this constant work of constructing an identity for ourselves that is especially exhausting for people of color and for people of non-normative genders and sexualities, people who for generations have not been seen as meeting the norm in some way. So all these are examples of the complexity of the world as we experience it today. And so, as I said, part of what makes this so difficult is we are getting more thrown at us, and at the same time, we are less equipped to deal with it. That we have lost many of the frameworks of meaning that enabled our predecessors to make sense of life and to make sense of themselves. And there are historical and psychological reasons for this. So historically, Viktor Frankl, someone who some of us teach in the core, he also addresses this what he refers to as a meaning vacuum. And this was decades ago that he was talking about this already, but the lack of meaning that so many people experience in life. And for him, he attributes that partly to a loss of traditions, in line with much of what I've said before. Someone like Peter Berger, who I just learned that Anthony studied with, Peter Berger talks about the fact that, well, in generations past, it was religion that would provide that meaning framework for people. Meaning provided the stories, the rituals, the images that gave meaning to life, that gave some kind of structure to it. I think about something like, think about a rite like a funeral. When we're confronted with death, and as we have been so often in the past year and a half, and we find ourselves staring into that void, how do we deal with it? Well, for many generations past, for example, in the Christian tradition, we have a rite for this. There's a script. We know what we have to do when someone dies, and we show up and we do those things. And there's a lot of consolation in that. But for so many people today, they've discarded or they have not taken up those traditions. And so they don't have those scripts. They don't have those stories to fall back on and to make sense of the reality. So again, in terms of how this has happened, I found Charles Taylor's work very helpful. His book, A Secular Age, describes how starting from a point in history where we had these stronger religious traditions, but then eventually through, I'll give you the very Cliff Notes version of that 800-page book, eventually exclusive humanism comes along and provides sort of an alternative narrative to human flourishing. But people didn't even find that quite satisfying. And so this opens up this Pandora's box. He describes it as the Nova effect, just an explosion of these different accounts of human flourishing, of how we're to live our life. And sort of the result of that is a fragilization of all of them, because it's no longer Christianity as the default or Judaism as the default, that there are a million different options and ideas about how to live the good life. All those alternatives are fragilized. Everyone is self-conscious or has some level of doubt about their tradition because of the presence of the others. And so this leads us to a place where there is no given, there is no default meaning framework, that this is something that everyone really is trying to sort out for themselves. And so, I see this reflected again in young people and my students who, when we talk about these different religious traditions in class, they'll say things like, well, no one can really know what's true in these different religions. They have a complete lack of hope of actually landing on anything that really is true or solid. They have a mentality of, you do you believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what I want to believe. So there are historical reasons that have led us to, this kind of complex existence that we live in today. But I think Lonergan's really helpful in understanding some of the psychological dynamics behind this as well. Lonergan he'd point to, he'd talk in the language of alienation from the transcendental precepts. So he would say that authentic cognition, that authentic subjectivity, being authentic human beings, is dependent upon attending, understanding, judging, deciding, being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible. But we have become alienated from that. We have succumbed to bias. We have become too fixated on the interest of ourselves or our groups. And so we are not thinking in ways that are attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible. We're simply thinking in terms of what is going to benefit us, that we listen to what we want to hear. We see this all over the place in terms of the filter bubbles that we experience on social media, especially the echo chambers of just hearing over and over again from the people who agree with us. So the result of this, Lonergan says, it's that the alienation from that kind of authentic cognition that leads to decline in our traditions. He said a really helpful quote. He talks about he says that people, if you think about perhaps the average faithful, you think about our students, he would say they lack the genius to transform a tradition into some simpler, vital, and intelligible whole. That the religion that has been handed on to them no longer makes sense to them. They don't see how it holds together. They don't see how it has relevance to their lives. And so Lonergan says that tradition degenerates. The meaning and values of human living are impoverished. And so again, I see this very clearly in working with my students and other young people, that the traditions that they have received, they don't make sense to them. They don't find meaning in them. And so you can understand why a lot of people are walking away from those traditions that do not have meaning for them. So just to sum up what I've been talking about is we're caught in this double bind of living in a world that is increasingly complex, and we're trying to find our way through it with fewer resources to support us in that work. And so you think about, what obviously is going to happen in this situation? If you think about, a structure, a house that is built on a flimsy foundation, As you add more and more weight, eventually it's going to collapse, right? And the same is true of our mental well-being, of our psychological functioning. There are limits to what we can take. And so if just more and more is being piled on top of us all the time, and we don't have adequate supports to hold us up, then it's no surprise that we see this really troubling increase in poor mental health across people in this country. Arises in anxiety and depression that, again, even Pope Francis is now drawing attention to. So where do we begin to respond to this? Obviously, we need the first responders. Universities all across the country have really been bulking up in terms of their counseling services. And that's absolutely necessary. That's really important. We need to be able to catch people as they are falling. But, and this is more of what I want to talk about here, we also need to address the long-term task of constructing meaning and supporting people in the work of constructing meaning for their lives, of developing habits that are going to help them to make sense of life in a postmodern world, that are going to enable people to live faithful lives in a postmodern world. So that's the more constructive work that I'm up to in this book, and that's what I want to talk about in the rest of the time here. So what role might Christian educators play in reversing this deterioration of meaning? So first, just to address what is not helpful. I think it should be clear based on what I've been laying out so far that simply giving more information, simply teaching is not going to be adequate. Very often I hear in Catholic circles, it's put forward, whether by bishops or pastors or catechists, that we just need better catechesis. And that's really important. It is true that a lot of people do not really understand the faith. So that is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Because what that accomplishes, if people have no framework for making sense of the additional information, then it's just more fragments. To give an analogy, my wife and I really enjoy Jim Gaffigan. He's a stand-up comedian, happens to be a Catholic, also a father of, I think, 4 or 5 kids. And he talks about how people kind of look at him with suspicion when he finds out he has so many kids, and they ask him, what's it like to have that many kids? And his response is like, well, it's like you're drowning and then someone throws you a baby. And I think very often that we're doing something similar in terms of how we're trying to help our young people. They are drowning. They are being overwhelmed with information and messages about how they should be, how they should live their lives. And if all we do is throw more information at them, it's just simply adding more fragments. It's more pressure. It's more that they cannot integrate, that they cannot deal with. And so, rather than simply throwing people another baby, we also need to teach them how to swim. We need to help them to learn to make sense. So what this looks like is a lot of what I'm trying to lay out in this book. And the language that I use to describe this is we need to support people in post-critical meaning making or post-critical imagining. So let me explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So today we live in a critical culture. In some ways this resembles the kind of age of theory that Lonergan talks about. Our means of knowing have become very sophisticated. We're living on really kind of a scientific paradigm of knowing, that the way to know something is to analyze it, to experiment with it, to dissect it. And that has gotten us a lot. It has raised the standard of living. It has enhanced our technology. There have been a lot of gains of this. But there's a downside to this as well, that a merely analytical or scientific approach to reality or life also has the effect of emptying things of their meaning. So think about, like, the other day at dinner, I joked about something to my wife, and my 5-year-old daughter says, "Why is that funny?" And then I have to explain the joke, and the joke's not funny anymore, right? Once you have to explain it. Something is lost when the wholeness, when the life, when the dynamism of the joke is analyzed and broken down, it loses something. And the same is true for our religious symbols, for our rituals. There are certain things about life that give meaning to our days. But when you simply dissect and analyze, you somehow evacuate those things of their meaning. And so as the scientific paradigm has enabled us to gain a lot, there's also, I find, been an inadequate attention to our subjectivity, to our human need for meaning, to our need for symbols and rituals and the life that those can give to them. So I'm not denigrating that. I'm not criticizing critical thought. We need it, but what we need is a way of thinking and living our lives that is post-critical, in the sense of not getting rid of analysis, but that is a way that is both integrative and critical, that uses the tools of critical thinking in order to appropriate the meaning of symbols, rituals, and stories. This is like what Paul Ricoeur refers to as a second naivete. So I think Lonergan's work is helpful in fleshing out, what this kind of post-critical consciousness or meaning making might look at. And so 2 terms of his that I think are helpful are to talk about self-appropriation and self-transcendence. So first, to talk about self-appropriation.
That's my fault.
I was going to blame the technology. You didn't have to say anything. Sorry, I let you get comfortable. So one aspect of what I mean by by doing this work of post-critical meaning making is the work of self-appropriation. So Lonergan, as I represented here, Lonergan describes authentic cognition or authentic subjectivity as following these patterns of attending, understanding, judging, and deciding. And so I think for people to really make sense of life, to have a meaningful life today, it means doing this work in a way that applies both to a person's own interiority, but also to external realities. So, very basically, into what I mean by applying this to one's interiority is just recognizing that you yourself are a meaning maker. That meaning is not just given. This is not a brick that you find and just carry along with you. That meaning is constructed in a sense, or as Lonergan says, that it requires minds. It requires minds at work. And so a very basic step towards being able to make better sense of the world is to recognize that we have our own responsibility for doing this. That we need to be intentional about making sense of the reality that we encounter. And so I think obviously this is what Lonergan was up to in Insight, is developing a series of exercises to help people appropriate their own subjectivity, or I would say their own meaning making. Other people like Mark Morelli have developed books that do more of this. But even more basically, I find that something like the Ignatian Examen can be a really useful tool in this regard. In a very basic way, to get people to start to pay attention to their own interiority, to their thoughts, to their intentions, to their feelings. And so by spending time doing that, for example, as a person is reviewing their own day, can be really helpful in just becoming more aware of how we are making meaning. So we need to apply this to our own interiority. We need to apply this also to external reality. So this can include things like one's religious tradition or the culture that one encounters in the world. And again, in terms of thinking of our students, it's important, I think, that they learn to make sense of what they experience in the culture. So what they're experiencing in the media, in social media, and their devices, on Netflix, to try and make sense of that in a way that is active, rather than just sort of passively receiving all these things. Because the images we see, the movies we watch, the music that we listen to, these are forming our consciousness. They are forming our understanding and our vision of the world that we live in. But very often we're sort of passive recipients of of those messages. There have been some studies that have shown that college students are really terrible at identifying fake news stories or identifying images that have been doctored on social media. And so there's a real need for them to learn how to arrive at better judgments of what is true and real, though. In terms of thinking about our traditions, again, as I pointed out, so many people today, they have no standard script that they're falling back on. They're simply experiencing a world of fragments, of many different pieces that they're trying to put together in some kind of coherent way. And so they need to be active. We need to be active in this regard as well, is not simply trying to passively receive meaning for our lives, because the meaning we receive is not going to be coherent. But we need to go looking for it. We need to be intentional about it. And so when we think about how we are giving people access to to the Christian tradition and the meaning that lies therein, I think that that David Tracy is one person. His work on religious classics is really helpful. He talks about a religious classic as not just a text, but it could be an image, it could be an event, a person, but it's something that we encounter where we experience an excess, a surplus of meaning. So when we read, think about the kind of classics that we teach in the core. So something like the stories of Scripture or the Bhagavad Gita. Or Augustine's Confessions. These are classics for a reason, because as people have been reading them for in some cases thousands of years, people continue to find something that is meaningful for them in their lives. So Tracy would say that at a time where so many people are lacking meaning, we need to go in search of it. We need to turn to these kind of classics. We need to turn to the symbols, the doctrines, the rituals, the practices of our traditions, and seek that meaning in them. But again, it's as Lonergan would say, it's not enough merely to take a look. We need to utilize the full range of our cognitive abilities. And so I'm putting it up here just an example of an assignment that I have my students do, my undergrad students do on a weekly basis, where I ask them to look at one of the readings that we've done. So this could be a Platonic text. It could be something from Scripture. It could be Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I ask them to go through these steps that Lonergan has laid out, to really carefully attend, understand, judge, decide. And so to kind of get them in the habit of thinking in this kind of way. So before I move on to the next part, I just want to emphasize briefly how important I think attending, how important I think, oops, going the wrong way, how important I think attention is. Lonergan said that he thought that there had been an oversight of insight. And so he wrote this very large book. I'm just giving a 40-minute lecture, so you're welcome. But I think there's really been an oversight of the importance of attention, although I see more and more attention to attention in scholarship these days. And this is why. Again, think about the example of so many of our confirmation classes that are offered in our Catholic parishes. And very often what these amount to is it's sort of a final class before Catholic graduation. And there's this misperception that after you've been confirmed, you are now fully formed. You know everything you need to know to be a Christian. But that is patently not the case. That is not the case, especially when we were dealing with the mystery of God. There is always more to learn. We can always deepen our understanding. And so it's, to have this kind of, very once and for all idea of formation, or a very static idea of what doctrine is really inadequate for the Christian life or any kind of fully human life. There are abundant warnings in Scripture against the dangers of idolatry, of reducing God to something that is too small, that is too simple. Augustine warned us that, whatever image you have in your head, however you think you understand God, that is not God. God is something bigger, something more mysterious. It also, I think this is abundantly clear in our culture today, how problematic it becomes when we reduce things or people to labels. Conservative or progressive, Democrat, Republican, whatever phrases you want to use, good Catholic, bad Catholic, cafeteria Catholic. What happens when we put a label on something is that our thinking shuts down. We tend to get content with the label when we think that because we've put a label on something or someone, we understand that person. And that is never the case. Palma has heard me repeat numerous times, one of my favorite things about one of our common favorite authors is to never accept a label in place of a story. There is always more texture, there is always more nuance in the life of a human being than we are often willing to admit. So I talk about the importance of attentiveness. I think this is so basic and so important. As important it is to understand, to arrive at concepts, to arrive at understandings, it's also important to keep our mind open and active so that we do not rest satisfied with mere labels. Okay, so secondly, I think that Lonergan's idea of self-transcendence is also really important for understanding what it means to embody a kind of post-critical meaning making that might be more adequate to life in the world today. So this is the case because what I've been talking about, this kind of meaning making that might be more adequate, it's going to involve not just education and not even formation. We're really talking about a transformation of consciousness. We're talking about not just what a person knows, not just what images are in a person's mind, but how they know, how they think, how they see. As important as skills are, we talk a lot in the university about critical thinking skills, and those are important. But what I'm advocating for here is something even more than skills. It is a conversion of the way that we are thinking and seeing, and hence this is why I gave the book this title, Converting the Imagination. What we're looking for, if people are struggling to make meaning, if they're struggling to find wholeness in life, we need to help people to see, to have a vision of that wholeness of life. One of my favorite lines from Proverbs, I think it is that without a vision, the people perish. So we need to help people to form that kind of vision for their lives. So why? To speak theologically, one reason why is the problem of sin. St. Augustine described sin, or the situation of the sinful human being, as homo incurvatus in se, the human being curved in on himself or herself. That when we become too enclosed upon ourselves, we reduce our humanity. We become something less. In more Lonerganian terms, when we succumb to bias, we're succumbing to some kind of self-centeredness or a group-centeredness that is cutting us off, that is excluding us from a fuller reality or a fuller understanding. And so I won't read this whole quotes, but just a couple of key quotes from Method that Lonergan is pointing to. What's the result of this? in the absence of love, in the absence of something that opens us, that extends us beyond of ourselves, we experience a trivialization of human life. And I think we see this all over the place in the throwaway culture that Pope Francis criticizes. As my students were just talking about in class, they experience the dating scene as a game. Everyone's just using each other. Life becomes trivialized when we cease to open ourselves to something beyond ourselves. And so as a remedy for this, Lonergan really, I think, ardently believes that religion can play a role in restoring progress, in returning us to that fullness of life that Jesus offers, insofar as it helps people to transcend themselves, as it promotes that kind of self-transcendence. And so the Lonerganians are maybe aware to the point of fatigue of Lonergan's 3 conversions, but I think these are helpful in terms of thinking through what it looks like to transcend oneself. So Lonergan talks about a kind of intellectual conversion, an intellectual self-transcending that involves opening ourselves up to a fuller reality in terms of what we know and how we know. This, and what I'm going to say right now, this goes a bit beyond what I do in the book. More and more, I'm starting to recognize the value of contemplative pedagogy, a way of teaching that really invites people to go deep into their own interiority, to go deep into the text or the material. And I think one advantage of that is simply helping people to recover a sense of wonder of what they're studying, or a sense of wonder or awe for other human beings. Jesus said that it would be children and the childlike who enter into the kingdom of God. And I think this has everything to do with the fact that children, they know how to wonder at reality. As Lonergan would say, they give free rein to their questions. And as a result of that, the world is a wonderful place for children. Not at the hour of 5 p.m. In my experience with my kids, but most of the time, it's a wonderful place because they live in a reality that's bigger, that they experience things in depth. And so, I think there are ways that we can recover that. And I think that's part of this kind of post-critical meaning making, is not to be so jaded, not to simply be analyzing, not trying to master things in the way that we know, but to simply attend, to dwell in things, to behold the beauty of the people in the things that we study. Whether that beauty might be in a poem, in a mathematical proof, in cell structures, in nature, whatever the case might be. And so a very concrete, practical way that I've been doing this increasingly in my classes is by using Lectio Divina. And I use that in different ways with my theology classes. I have the freedom to do that in such a way that we read a text slowly. I invite the students to meditate upon it, and then actually to let that lead into a time of prayer. But even in secular contexts, people are now using a modified Lectio Divina to simply invite students to read something slowly, to dwell in it, to meditate upon it, rather than just analyzing it, rather than trying to get something from the text or to argue against it to prove how smart they are. As happens very often in doctoral seminars and other places. Beyond the intellectual conversion, there is a moral conversion, a moral self-transcendence, where we're living not just for self-gratification, but we're living for something bigger than ourselves. Again, I've been really inspired by Pope Francis and his writing, his urging us to build a culture of encounter, where we can really engage, where we really encounter one another. I just heard a story from a friend this past week that exemplifies this really well. He was hosting an exhibit at a conference, and a woman walks into the exhibit, and he says, "Hello, how are you doing?" And she says, "Oh, fine, okay, fine." And he pauses and he looks her in the eyes and says, no, really, I want to know, how are you doing? And with that, the walls kind of crumble down. And she says, honestly, like, I'm kind of depressed. I feel alone. I feel like I'm the only one who doesn't fit in here. And then they could begin to have a real conversation. And I think we can do that same sort of thing. And, in our faith communities, in our classrooms, to invite our students to really see each other, to let them have the experience of us really seeing them and really listening to them. And finally, Lonergan points to a religious conversion, to falling in love in a deep and definitive kind of way. And I have found no better articulation of this than this poem, this prayer that's often attributed to Father Pedro Arrupe, the former superior of the Jesuits. To fall in love, to become a being in love, where we are living no longer just for ourselves, but for something else, to be living for God. This more than anything can pull us out of ourselves. And this is something that Lonergan, I think, rightly says we cannot achieve, we cannot accomplish. We can open ourselves to it in prayer, but ultimately this conversion comes as a result of God's grace. So when these things happen, when we manage to transcend ourselves in this way, the fruit of this is a deeper understanding. So understanding things more deeply, of being more connected to one another, of being more at peace, of experiencing a sense of wholeness. So much of our problem, I believe, is that we are too stuck in our own heads. We are too stuck within ourselves. And so I think that Augustinian insight of us being human beings curved in on ourselves captures very well our situation, and it really captures the problem of today. So I see I'm already talking more than I wanted to, so I'm going to try and move to a speedy conclusion here. So just a final note, that all this work I've been describing is this work of trying to support people in becoming post-critical meaning makers, to find more meaning in life today. This is the work not just of individual teachers, but of communities. That is essential, I believe. That this is the work of communities, it's the work of becoming community. That we have to be aware that with any community, whether that's a parish or a classroom of people, a university, a faculty, it's always going to be a mix of people in varying stages of their development, of their understanding, of their spiritual growth. And so rather than demanding that everybody be in one place, rather than demanding that everyone live up to this standard right now or you're out, we need to have communities of growth, of accompaniment, where we can journey people towards that ideal. One of the best examples of this, at least one that I know very well personally, is this communion and liberation. So a small kind of faith community within the Catholic Church, where I have been incredibly impressed by the relentlessness with which people ask questions, and those questions are welcome, even to the point of challenging the writings and the assertions of the founder of the order. So we can have these kind of communities within our church, within our parishes, here in a university. I think places like our classes in the core, in religion, theology, philosophy, these can be ideal situations to really invite this kind of questioning and growth. But most of all, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I would just say that what makes for a meaningful, fulfilled life, it's community. Dorothy Day said this in The Law and Loneliness, that what's the answer to the law and loneliness? It's community. It's that experience of belonging, of being loved, of being cared for. And so for all the rest of the stuff, if that is lacking, then we will have missed the boat, and people will not be living into that fullness of life that we all aspire to. Okay, so I've been trying to lay out what I understand to be sort of the roots of this deterioration of meaning that we experience in our culture and our communities today. And I've really been making a case for how I think that we as educators, maybe especially Christian educators, can do something about that, can lead people deeper within themselves in terms of recognizing their own role as meaning makers, but also a transcending of self, of getting out of ourselves so that we are more in touch with reality, more in touch with one another. I think that is at least a brief sketch of the path towards a more meaningful kind of life. Thank you for your attention. I'd love to have a conversation.
We can begin with some questions from the physical space.
Well, we've already got one.
Pivot to the virtual space as needed.
If somebody is sick, even let's say a young person, how, like in their home, the idea of community, how can they develop a sense of community?
Yeah. So as maybe as negatively as I talked about technology at times, I mean, I do think this has been a help, that we do have means of connecting with people. My wife works in a parish, and what they heard from so many people over the course of the past year and a half is that at least being able to watch Mass from home, or better yet, to be able to connect with a small group using Zoom or something like that, at least that's some kind of lifeline. That being said, there is something that is undeniably lost when we are not physically present to one another. And so, again, like part of my wife's job is to bring communion to the homebound. And I think that's such a beautiful moment, such a beautiful ritual, because when a Eucharistic minister does that, part of that prayer service and bringing communion to that person is to assure them that they are in the prayers of the community. But it's a person physically going there to be with them,